The United States went to the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Summit in Laos in July of 2024. And at this summit, the United States met with many of its counterparts, especially those it considers to be valuable chips in its build up to war with China. And we're going to get into the fruits of that, the dangerous fruits of that bring us to possibly the precipice of war with China. But first, I want to show you how they spoke to China. There was a lot of lecturing going on to China. So first, we have Antony Blinken looking like the clown that he is, talking about how China needs to be warned that Kamala Harris cares about the rules-based order too, that they're not going to get on over Kamala Harris if she becomes president. Saturday's meeting, so this is back in July, okay, of July 27th, as all of this build up to war with Hezbollah is happening between Israel and Hezbollah. So in a sign of political tumult back home in Washington, Antony Blinken delivered a message on Saturday to his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi that Vice President Harris, not just President Biden, is committed to the rules-based international order. The two chief diplomats met for more than an hour on the sidelines of the foreign ministers meeting of the ASEAN nations, which was being held in the Laotian capital. It was a sixth meeting since resuming relations in June last year after a tense hiatus in which most high-level contacts were put on hold between the two countries. Blinken said that both the president and the vice president believe that stability in the relationship is important, and that both also believe it's important to uphold the rules-based international order. His effort to speak on behalf of Harris and not just the president was a sign that the administration is taking steps to convey political continuity to U.S. rivals after the surprise decision for Biden to drop out. So isn't that wonderful? The United States is using hostile rhetoric with China at a foreign ministers meeting between ASEAN nations in order to convey political unity. But not only this, you had Janet Yellen also meeting with her Chinese counterparts and once again claiming overcapacity is the problem. So Secretary of State Janet Yellen said she would press China to address the country's macroeconomic model that has led to overcapacity, claiming it poses a threat to the viability of firms and workers globally. Saying Chinese observers are noting and criticizing Yellen for engaging in a political show to shift the blame for U.S.'s domestic problems to China and win votes for the Democrats. The real purpose behind hyping China's new energy overcapacity is to contain China's advantage in new energy industry, observers said, calling on the U.S. to stop its hegemonic coercion and respect market economic principles and international trade rules. So again, overcapacity. What does that mean? China is doing too much. China is trading too much. China's developing too much. China is supposedly putting a glut on the market and controlling key markets. Well, the United States has placed 100% tariffs on China's electric vehicle industry as sanctions on polysilicon in the Xinjiang region over so-called human rights. The U.S. is doing a lot on this front to try to smear China economically. So that was all happening, a kind of a total economic and diplomatic ploy. But what really ended up being significant, and this is very significant, this is very scary in a lot of ways. The United States is recreating a warfighting command in Japan because of the threat from China. This is The Economist, hastens the biggest military transformation in the Pacific in decades. So this is what, okay, so Japan, of course, an ASEAN member, met with the United States on the sidelines. Foreign ministers, we don't have a foreign minister in the United States. We have Antony Blinken. But nonetheless, Japan agreed to allow this. This is what the big issue is in reality. This is a major escalation. So, America's largest air base in the Pacific, the Kadena Air Base, is roughly 650 kilometers from the coast of China. As the missile flies, jets constantly roar over children's playgrounds on their way to and from patrols. But American forces there have, in effect, been on a peacetime footing since the end of the Vietnam War. That changed when Lloyd Austin, America's defense secretary, announced the creation of a new warfighting command to oversee all American forces in Japan. The historic shift, as Austin calls it, is a sign of alarm with which America and Japan regard the threat from China. which is rapidly building up its armed forces. The aim of the headquarters is both to strengthen defense of Japan, once a rear base for operations, but increasingly likely to be on the front line of any conflict with China, and to mirror Japan's plans to create an American-style joint command to fuse air, sea, and other land and other forces early next year. This is finally the transformation of U.S.-Japan relations from what used to be a mainly basing agreement to project U.S. military power into a true military alliance, said the CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies, a U.S. government think tank based in Washington, D.C., as they say. The move may deepen China's worries about encirclement and intensify complaints that the U.S. is trying to build an Asian NATO. And of course, here we get the apologetics. No, there's no mutual obligation to defend each other. There's none of that from the United States and their so-called allies. It's just an administrative headquarters. They're just going to be liaising with the government. Okay, so this is big because we know that all of that BS, right? All that administrative BS. We know that they're really preparing for war. In any war with China, communications with frontline forces of Japan and elsewhere in the Western Pacific are likely to be heavily disrupted by cyber attacks, sabotage of undersea cables, or conflict in space to neutralize each other's surveillance and communications. So a forward-deployed operational command center, well within range of China's missiles, brings memories of Douglas MacArthur, who fought many battles against Japan in the Philippines and Papua New Guinea, much closer to action than Nimitz, sometimes dangerously so. He later ruled Japan after its surrender. So this is what they're literally admitting. They're literally admitting that they're integrating Japan's military with the United States's. And this is going to be a forward deployed command center, which will give the United States even better capabilities to essentially not just control Japan, but to use the entire Asia Pacific as a battering ram against China, supposedly. Because we have to ask ourselves, can they do it? Can they succeed? NATO, under U.S. leadership, is not succeeding in Ukraine. Certainly nothing we are seeing in West Asia is succeeding militarily if we think and understand and see that the axis of resistance has absolutely been able to not just build up, but show that it has the capacity to strike back against Israel and the United States. Ansarallah, a little movement has the ability to strike back at the United States, get into Tel Aviv, right? And it hasn't used nowhere near just this one force its full capacity. So can China, with hundreds of billions of dollars of US dollars worth of a military budget, right? Can the United States defeat China in the Pacific? Is this war a realistic option? Well, the New York Times says absolutely not. Here's a New York Times op-ed. Beijing can take the South China Sea without firing a shot. This is around the same time as this agreement. And look, every admission from the United States, okay, every admission from the U.S. media, mainstream media, is always to justify more war spending and to justify further involvement. It's never to not do it, okay? It's never to not engage in conflict. That's just important to say. Over the past 15 years, China has expanded its military presence in the South China Sea. It has laid claim to nearly all strategic waterway, a vital shipping lifeline of the global economy, rich in energy and fishery resources. China has used non-military assets such as its coast guard, fishing vessels, and maritime militia to bully its neighbors, blockade ships, and build Chinese military bases on disputed islands. America is partly to blame. It's condemned its behavior, but eager to avoid escalation, it's consistently refrained from standing up militarily, which has only emboldened Beijing. A new approach is needed. The U.S. must take real action to strengthen alliances and confront China before it eventually takes control of a huge body of water without firing a shot. Like any unchallenged bully, China has become increasingly aggressive. So they talk about the Philippines encounter, which is a reaction to the U.S. arming the Philippines and allowing them to go to the Renai Jiao beat up boat and send weapons there, and the bases that have been built on the Philippines. But they'll tell you that it was China that was bullying them. And then, of course, there's the disputes between the Philippines and Vietnam. They're hyping up concerns, okay? But The fears, they say, are overblown, okay? Fears of China going into full conflict mode over Taiwan, over the Philippines. This is what this is. I'm summarizing this, okay? They're overblown. Why? This person has studied Chinese military strength. I'm convinced if the U.S. were to take a more assertive stance in the South China Sea, Beijing would likely back down and avoid a war it knows it would lose. So this is what the point of this article is. It's not to say, well, China can just take it without fighting or China. It already is. It's to say that China is just winning right now because the United States is not doing enough. Okay? And so they're going to argue that the South China Sea is more vulnerable, but this assumes that every country, ASEAN countries, Pacific countries, are just going to fall in line with the United States. So we don't even have to read the rest because it is a position of hubris saying that China will lose. China will lose a war with the United States because the United States, if it can galvanize its allies like it just did with Japan, that would mean that China would be the one surrounded and be the one that would have to back down. Well, this is an interesting position coming out of the New York Times because we've already had many war games. Many. I'll just show you one. Center for New American Security. What is it? It is a U.S. State Department backed, U.S. Defense Department backed, military contractor funded think tank. And they've war gamed scenarios. And this is over Taiwan. And why is it so important? Because the United States will never say it is going to wage a war with China in the South China Sea for the South China Sea. Why? Because that would mean it would be projecting a kind of imperial power that it has to accuse China of doing. It has to accuse China of being the aggressive one, of building up its military, even though all evidence is to the contrary. Yes, China has been increasing its military spending. Yes, it has been advancing its military technology and apparatus, but it's been doing that in response to the United States, which has literally increased its military budget by hundreds of billions in the last several decades. Why? Mainly to move toward a conflict with China. Look at any military budget that's been passed in the last several national defense authorization acts, and every single one will say more money, more weapons, more aid in order to fight, in order to build up toward China, in order to confront China, whatever they're saying. But here is the Center for New American Security. This is what they had to say about the gaming lab they did of the war over Taiwan. See, Taiwan is the victim. Taiwan is a small island that they can claim is being oppressed by China, and it wants to be independent, but China's not letting them, and China has made all these threats. So China is the big boy here. China is the big boy that's trying to suppress the little boy, and so the U.S. can act like it is David when in fact it is a Goliath that I guess is fast looking like looking a lot smaller than maybe it did in the past. But here we have, okay, what happened. The war game, all right, so we're not going to read the whole thing, but the war game indicated no quick victory for either side if China decides to invade Taiwan. Neither side felt it, although it had lost the fight over Taiwan, and even though, so neither side felt as though it had lost the fight over Taiwan, and even though China hoped to achieve a swift and decisive victory, it was prepared for a long fight. Beijing was faced with a dilemma, whether to keep the war limited in the hope the U.S. did not become involved, or preemptively strike U.S. targets to improve Chinese probability of success, but at a high cost of prolonging the conflict. In such a scenario, neither Beijing nor Washington is likely to have the upper hand for the first week of the conflict, which suggests a protracted conflict. So, consequences far beyond what Beijing and Washington intend if this war were to happen. How quickly the conflict could escalate with both the U.S. and China crossing red lines. A high risk that deterrent signals may be misread in a potential future fight due to differences in military strengths and weaknesses, and these shape the types of escalations Beijing and Washington are to select. Despite declared policy of no first use, China may be willing to brandish nuclear weapons or conduct demonstration of its nuclear capability in an effort to end or prevent U.S. involvement in the conflict. So, The war game also highlighted additional asymmetry, the role of capable U.S. allies and partners could play in a future conflict. Not only does China lack such relationships, this is what they're trying to always promote, right? But capable military partners on the U.S. side add significant combat power, depth, and strategic significance to efforts to defend Taiwan. They, of course, are not including Russia. They're not including the rest of the multipolar world. But nonetheless, we have to understand that even just talking about nuclear deterrence and the fact that this would be a protracted conflict means that the United States doesn't win. That's what it means. It means the United States doesn't win. The United States does not win a conflict if it does not take out China's capabilities immediately because there's a nuclear option. That is an admission that they cannot win. So China is already prepared. The Center for New American Security has said it, that there are differences in capabilities, that the United States would have to fight a particular kind of war. And of course, they're going to hype up the allies because this is what the United States has to rely on. They have to rely on other countries in the region to do its dirty work. But the problem is that if those countries try to do the US's dirty work in a way that steps over China's red line, well, then what stops China from using its geographic and military capabilities to disarm these countries? This is the nightmare scenario that the United States is literally wargaming. This is the nightmare scenario that the New York Times is literally provoking. And this is a nightmare scenario that the United States has literally went forward with to an even greater degree by establishing this command center with Japan. Now, I want to show you. So this is a bad look for the United States. The United States is not going to make it through this. But the United States also has another problem, okay? And that is that China does not have to use the United States' means, does not have to copy the United States in order to win this war. Here is in the South China Morning Post. I found a great article describing how China is already winning this war without firing a shot. The real reason why they have to hype up allies, why the United States has to hype up allies, because it can't, not only can it not do it on its own militarily, but China is already winning economically and geopolitically and economically. So here we have the Belt and Road Initiative is picking up momentum amid increasing synergy with countries in the expanding BRICS grouping. This is how emerging nations are already dethroning the West, and that means China. The United States and certain European countries may emerge from their current state of political brawling to find the world has changed while they were otherwise occupied and that they are no longer in charge of it. Power is moving southward. One little remarked upon aspect of the shifting balance of global power is the increasing cooperation between BRICS grouping of countries in the China-centered Belt and Road Initiative. Launched in 2013 by President Xi Jinping of China, the initiative is a geo-economic program designed to project influence by peaceful means. China cannot impose infrastructure connectivity on others to further its grand designs unless they are willing to participate. Even other members within BRICS have been reluctant to embrace Belt and Road projects, arguably for fear of alienating key Western powers with which they have close relationships. One of the largest among them, however, in BRICS, Brazil, has plans to join the initiative. As reported, Brazil President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has stated that his administration is putting together a proposal to join. The rapidly expanding family of BRICS nations can economically benefit from taking part in the Belt and Road Initiative in the form of infrastructure networks linking them to the world's second largest economy, measured by gross domestic product. Member nations also benefit from being connected to each other and having alternative sources of financing. Yet against these positive attractions, these countries have been factoring potential disapproval of Western nations that have engaged in a flurry of rival initiatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. But Western countries are now perceived to be in a state of political disarray, in the case of the U.S., a problematic fiscal state. And China is taking advantage of a strengthened position of international authority as geopolitical rivals mired in domestic woes are less likely or able to take any united stand against nations that support the initiative. So, and that is an understatement of the century, because it's not just that. It's the fact that the United States and its Western allies will not. He said that there's a flurry of rival projects, but those rival projects aren't producing anything. They're not producing anything. And this is what he's about to get to. So Hung Tron, a resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank, says that, quote, many Belt and Road Initiative loans have been concluded using Chinese laws and dispute settlements instead of Western ones, such as British laws traditionally used in bank lending. China is continuing to open up to the outside world, but presumably more on Chinese terms than Western terms, and there lies the problem. That's the big problem here. That's why China is aggressive. That's why China is a threat, not because of its military, whether there's going to be a war. The US is the one preparing for that in a very suicidal way. But it's because China's ability to fund infrastructure projects that enhance its own access to global trade and investment has been increasingly questioned as financial implications of the man projects becomes clear. But however, a number of developments suggest a bolder approach might be taken by the initiative going forward. So here we have it. We have the bank. We have banking capital being factored in. What we are essentially seeing is the United States being completely rejected on the financial arena, and that is leading the United States to become desperate on the military arena. Launched in 2016 amid great expectations it could challenge the World Bank Group, the Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank adopted a fairly low profile. It has only invested 53.8 US billions of dollars in 276 projects, and its assets are well below the World Bank's US's 347 billion at about 61 billion. But the bank has been conservatively managed under Jin Luqin, China's former vice minister of finance. But now, and he has kept the AIIB at arm's length as far as Belt and Road. But high-level financial sources have suggested that Jin's current 5-year term at the AIIB is likely to be extended and that the bank could become more important in funding the initiative, as well as complementing BRICS' $100 billion authorized capital new development bank. So Brazil, right? Brazil's Dilma Rousseff owns that bank essentially. They're the ones who are leading that bank. They don't own it, but they lead it. Dilma Rousseff is who is in charge of the BRICS bank. And then you have the expansion of Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE in January. Thailand and Malaysia are interested in joining. Indonesia is interested in joining. Vietnam is interested in joining. Kazakhstan is interested in joining. So on and on and on. So the BRICS is going to expand. Kazan is about to happen in October, the BRICS summit led by Russia this time. And this author is saying that Western nations have to wake up to the reality that their dominance in trade and investment is going away, and that the Belt and Road Initiative, while there isn't any memorandum for BRICS countries to participate in it, and that likely won't ever occur, there's going to be a lot of synergy between the two. So what does this tell us? It tells us that China is not a threat because of some kind of aggression, right? The US is building up toward a suicidal war with China because of developments like this, because China is building a different way of organizing, of doing economics, of organizing the world order. It is building a multipolar world order away from US diktats. That is what is so problematic for the United States. And that's why they're trying to bring together so-called allies. They're trying to move into this sphere of influence in the Asia Pacific. They're trying to dominate. Japan is now once again essentially back to World War II level threats, right? In World War II, after it lost World War II, Japan was completely demilitarized, and the US essentially occupied Japan. And that was a power play. It wasn't all benevolence. It wasn't just, oh, US is for democracy. It's for the end of that kind of fascistic rule. No, the US said, wow, this is a great opportunity to expand into the Asia Pacific. Let us occupy Japan. Let us be the bulwark, the force that helps rebuild Japan so that Japan can then serve us. And that is what has been happening for many decades. And now it's come to a crescendo point where the United States is so much in control of Japanese geopolitical of Japan's geopolitical role in the world that it has pushed Japan to not only neglect its a constitutional mandate to not increase its military budget above 1% of its total GDP. Now it has had Japan double its military spending, and increase not just its military basing structure, but to establish a command center, which essentially puts Japan even under further control of US policy, of US foreign policy. So this is a major escalation. More is coming. More is coming. This is not an alarm that is meant to sensationalize anything. When the United States does actions like this, it is serious about the overall objective. The US doesn't really have a strategy, of course. It doesn't have a policy that makes much sense from the standpoint of what the reality is on the ground in front of it. But it does have an overall objective, which is different from a strategy. The objective is to destroy China. The objective is to destroy any alternative in its path. And therefore, the United States, you can see from its record, has no shortage of reckless wars that it is engaged in order to meet that objective. Might not have been strategically smart, right? Especially after the Soviet Union fell, it might not have been smart to go full scale ahead in trying to destabilize every part of the world in order to cement hegemony. But that's what the United States did. And even as we see the crumbling edifice everywhere in the world, from Latin America to West Asia to Ukraine, the United States is going to continue to push in the Asia Pacific. And not only will it continue to push, but it will continue to move in the direction of war. And it is creating essentially a geopolitical minefield that the US and China, especially China, has to maneuver around. And the United States so hopes that China steps on one so that this war can ignite. Maybe not everyone in the foreign policy blob, but there are many in the foreign policy blob that want to see this happen. But all evidence shows that this war would not be pretty, this war would not be winnable, and that it could very well go nuclear. That is the consequence of trying to defeat a power like China, a rising power like China, with the most important economy in the world, with a completely different set of objectives and strategy on development, military, political, and economic, as well as a real peer competitor with nuclear weapons. This is what it means. It means that you, the United States, the so-called hegemon, are actually not in the favorable position that you thought you were. It is game over for the United States if it makes this move. Will it make it? The answer is eventually. And that's why it is our job. It is our duty to stop it. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.